I have always been a heavy sleeper. It used to be a point of pride for me. I could sleep through thunderstorms, sirens, even my alarm clock most mornings. But that changed 2 years ago. Now, the slightest creak of a floorboard has me sitting bolt upright, heart hammering against my ribs, scanning the darkness for movement. It all started when I moved into the duplex on 4th Street. It was an older building, a Victorian conversion that had seen better days, split right down the middle into 2 units. The rent was cheap and the location was close to my office, so I overlooked the peeling paint and the slightly slanted floors. My neighbor was a man named Elias. He was the kind of guy you would struggle to describe to a police sketch artist because there was simply nothing memorable about him. He was average height, average build, with thinning brown hair and a wardrobe that consisted entirely of beige and gray. When I moved in, he gave me a curt nod, mumbled something about keeping the noise down, and disappeared into his side of the house. I thought I had lucked out. A quiet, boring neighbor is the jackpot in a shared wall situation. Or so I thought. The house was built in such a way that our bedroom shared a wall. It was an old plaster and lath wall, surprisingly thick, but old houses have a way of carrying sound. For the first month, it was dead silent. Then, the noises began. It wasn't loud music or shouting. It was industry. It sounded like work. It started on a Tuesday night around 11 p.m. I was just drifting off when I heard a rhythmic, abrasive sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounded like sandpaper on wood, but aggressive, heavy. It went on for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped. I chalked it up to a late-night hobby and went to sleep. But the next night, it started again. And the night after that, the sounds evolved. Sometimes it was that rhythmic sanding. Other times it was a low electric hum, like a drill being run at very low desperate speed to dampen the noise. I met Elias at the mailboxes a week later. I tried to be casual. I asked him if he was doing some renovations. He looked at me, his eyes glassy and unblinking, and paused for just a second too long before answering. "Just fixing up some shelving," he said. His voice was flat, monotone. "Sorry if it woke you." "It's fine," I lied. "Just curious." The shelving project didn't stop. In fact, it escalated. The sounds moved. Initially, they seemed to come from the center of the wall. Then, over the weeks, the noises migrated closer to the corner of the room, right behind where my large oak wardrobe stood. This wardrobe was a beast, left by the previous tenant because it was too heavy to move. It covered a good 6 feet of the shared wall. Around the second month, the dust appeared. I came home from work to find a fine layer of white powder coating the top of my dresser and the floor near the wardrobe. I assumed it was just old house dust settling, but when I wiped it up, it felt gritty, like plaster. I checked the wall, but there were no cracks. I assumed the vibrations from his work were shaking loose debris from the old ceiling. Then, things started to go missing. It was small things at first, insignificant things. I couldn't find my car keys one morning. I tore the apartment apart, swearing I had left them on the hook by the door. I eventually found them inside the refrigerator, sitting on a shelf next to the milk. I laughed it off. I was stressed at work. Obviously, I was operating on autopilot and doing stupid things. A week later, it was my phone charger, then a single shoe, then my laptop. I found the laptop under my bed, pushed all the way to the back wall. I never put my laptop under the bed. That was the moment a cold spike of fear first pricked me. I sat on the floor, staring at the computer, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I kicked it under there in my sleep, but I knew I hadn't. I started feeling like I was losing my mind. I was constantly tired because Elias's renovations were now happening every single night, starting at 2 a.m. and lasting until 4 a.m. The sounds were softer now, stealthier. It sounded less like construction and more like movement, sliding, clicking. I banged on the wall one night. "Hey, keep it down." The noise stopped instantly. Dead silence. It stayed silent for the rest of the night. But the next morning, as I was leaving for work, I found a note slipped under my door. It was a piece of lined notebook paper with a single sentence scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The house is settling. Go back to sleep." That note terrified me more than the noise. It felt like a command. I decided to take a sick day. I needed to catch up on sleep, but I also needed to figure out what was happening. I waited until I saw Elias's beat-up sedan pull out of the driveway. Once he was gone, I went into my bedroom and pressed my ear against the shared wall. Silence. I walked over to the electrical outlet near the floor, the one closest to the wardrobe. I noticed the faceplate was loose. I grabbed a screwdriver and removed the plate. I shined a flashlight into the gap between the drywall and the electrical box. I expected to see insulation, maybe a brick firewall. Instead, I saw light. It was faint, but it was there. A tiny beam of daylight filtering through from the other side. The wall between our units wasn't solid brick. It had been hollowed out. My heart began to race. I put the faceplate back on and stared at the massive oak wardrobe. The noises always seemed to come from behind it. The dust was always worse there. I am not a strong person, and that wardrobe was solid wood, but adrenaline is a powerful thing. I emptied it of all my clothes to lighten the load. I braced my back against my bed frame and pushed with my legs, shoving the heavy furniture inch by painful inch across the floor. It took me 20 minutes to move it enough to see the wall behind it. When I finally looked, my blood ran cold. The plaster wall had been surgically altered. A rectangular section, about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, had been cut out. But it wasn't a hole. It was a door. Someone Elias had carefully cut through the lath and plaster on his side, and then on my side. He had attached hinges to the piece of wall he'd cut out, creating a seamless, hidden hatch that opened into my room. From a distance, with the wallpaper pattern, you would never notice the seams. He had sanded down the edges so perfectly that it fit flush. I reached out with a trembling hand and pushed on the panel. It didn't budge. It was locked from the other side. I wasn't crazy. The missing keys, the laptop under the bed, the dust. He had been coming in. He had been in my room while I slept. He had been moving my things, gaslighting me, playing a sick game. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. I didn't know what to do. I should call the police. Yes, the police. I pulled out my phone, but before I could dial, I heard the front door of the other unit open. He was back. I froze. I was standing in my bedroom, the wardrobe pushed aside, the secret door exposed. If he came in through that wall now, I was trapped. I heard his heavy footsteps on the floorboards next door. He was walking straight to his bedroom. My bedroom wall. I scrambled out of the room, grabbing my car keys, and bolted out the front door. I didn't lock it. I didn't look back. I jumped into my car and sped down the block, my hands shaking so hard I could barely steer. I pulled into a gas station parking lot 3 miles away and called 911. I met the police back at the house. 2 officers went in with me. When we entered my bedroom, the wardrobe was still moved, the secret door still exposed, but now it was slightly ajar. The officers drew their weapons and pushed the panel open. It swung inward, revealing Elias's bedroom. It was a small, dark room. The windows were painted black, and in the center of the room, facing the hole in the wall, was a single armchair. On the floor beside the chair was a cooler. Inside were sandwiches, bottles of water, and an empty jar. He had been sitting there, watching, night after night. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the chair. It was what was taped to the walls of his room. Photos, hundreds of them. Photos of me sleeping. Photos of me taken from the gap in the wardrobe doors. Photos of me taken from inches away, close-ups of my face while I was unconscious. In some of them, his hand was visible, hovering just above my forehead or touching a lock of my hair. He had been coming into my room for months. He had stood over me while I dreamed. He had moved my things just to see if I would notice, to test how deep my sleep really was. Elias wasn't in the house. He had heard me leave, or maybe he saw the wardrobe moved and knew the game was up. He fled. I moved out that day. I left most of my furniture. I couldn't bear to touch anything he might have touched. I stayed with a friend for weeks, sleeping on her couch with the lights on. They never caught Elias. He just vanished. Sometimes, late at night, in my new apartment on the 3rd floor of a secure building, I wake up to the sound of the building settling. A creak, a groan of wood, and I lie there, paralyzed, staring at the wall, waiting for a scene to open up, waiting for him to come back and finish watching. They say you should never judge a book by its cover. I think the more accurate advice is that you should never judge a neighbor by their baked goods. I lived in a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of place where kids ride bikes in the street and people actually return your Amazon packages if they get delivered to the wrong house. The jewel of our street was the house at the end of the lane, owned by Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable was the quintessential grandmother figure. She was tiny, maybe 5 feet tall on a good day, with white permed hair and cardigans for every season. She made cookies for new neighbors. She waved at every car that passed. But her real passion, her obsession, was her garden. Her backyard was massive, backing up into a dense stretch of woodland that separated our subdivision from the highway. And that backyard was a jungle of prize-winning vegetables. We're talking pumpkins the size of beanbag chairs, tomatoes as big as softballs, and zucchini that looked like baseball bats. She won the county fair blue ribbon every single year. I lived right next door. My bedroom window on the 2nd floor overlooked her yard. I often saw her out there, wearing her big straw hat, tending to her plants with a devotion that bordered on religious. But there were odd things. Things you tried to ignore because, well, she was a sweet old lady. First, there was the schedule. Mrs. Gable didn't garden in the morning. She didn't garden in the evening sun. Mrs. Gable did her heavy work between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. I'm an insomniac, so I'm often up reading or watching TV in the early hours. And almost every night, I'd see the beam of her heavy-duty flashlight cutting through the darkness of her yard. I'd hear the thwack of a shovel hitting the earth. Thwack. Lift. Thump. I asked her about it once over the fence. "Oh, honey," she'd said, her voice sweet as molasses. "The slugs come out at night. You have to catch them by surprise. Besides, the moonlight is good for the soil. It's an old country secret." I laughed and accepted the cookies she handed me. Then there was the smell. It wasn't constant. It happened maybe once a month. A thick, cloying stench would drift over the fence. It smelled like garbage left out in the sun, mixed with something sickly sweet, like cheap perfume sprayed over rotting meat. "Special fertilizer," she told me when I crinkled my nose. "Seaweed and fish meal. Smells awful, but look at those tomatoes." And you couldn't argue with the results. The vegetables were monstrous. The turning point was my dog, Barnaby. He was a golden retriever, friendly to a fault, and not the brightest bulb in the box. He loved Mrs. Gable because she always slipped him treats through the fence slats. One Tuesday, Barnaby went missing. I let him out in the backyard to do his business, and 10 minutes later, he was gone. I panicked. I ran around the neighborhood calling his name. I knocked on Mrs. Gable's door. She looked devastated. "Oh no, poor Barnaby. I haven't seen him, dear. I've been inside knitting all afternoon. I hope he didn't run into the woods." I searched for hours. Night fell. I was exhausted and heartbroken. I went upstairs to try and get some sleep, but I found myself staring out the window at her yard, hoping to see a golden blur running around. That's when I saw her. It was 2:30 a.m. Mrs. Gable was out there. She wasn't pruning. She was dragging something. She was pulling a heavy, dark tarp across the lawn toward her compost heap, which was located way back against the tree line. She was moving with a strength that didn't match her frail appearance. She wasn't hunched over. She was hauling this thing with purpose. A terrible thought wormed its way into my brain. Barnaby. Had she accidentally hit him with her car? Or found him injured and panicked? I had to know. I put on my shoes and crept downstairs. My flashlight was in the kitchen. I grabbed it and slipped out my back door. The air was thick with that smell of fertilizer. It was stronger tonight than I had ever smelled it. It made my eyes water. I hopped the low fence between our yards. The grass was wet with dew. I kept my light off, navigating by the moonlight. I could hear her at the back of the yard, the rhythmic thwack of the shovel. I crept closer, hiding behind her massive trellis of pole beans. I was about 30 feet away. Mrs. Gable was standing in a waist-deep hole. She was shoveling dirt onto something in the pit. The tarp lay empty beside the hole. I took a step forward, and a dry twig snapped under my boot. It sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Mrs. Gable stopped. She didn't spin around in panic. She went perfectly still. Slowly, she raised her head, sniffing the air like a predator. "Is someone there?" She called out. Her voice wasn't the sweet, old lady voice. It was steady, cold, and commanding. I held my breath. I should have run, but I needed to know if my dog was in that hole. She climbed out of the pit with surprising agility. She picked up the flashlight and swept the beam across the yard. I ducked lower behind the beans. The beam missed me by inches. She stood there for a long time and finally turned back to her work. She began to fill the hole rapidly. I waited until she went back inside the house. The moment her back door closed, I sprinted to the back of the yard. I fell to my knees at the fresh patch of dirt. The smell was unbearable here. It wasn't fish meal. It was death. I started digging with my bare hands. The soil was loose. I dug frantically, tears stinging my eyes, expecting to feel soft fur. My hand hit something hard. Not a dog. I pulled it up. It was a boot. A hiking boot. And inside the boot was a foot. I scrambled back, clapping a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. I shined my light into the hole. It wasn't Barnaby. It was a man, or parts of a man. I recognized the flannel shirt. It was the guy who read our meters. He had been transferred to a new route 2 weeks ago. I was staring at the corpses. Not just one. I could see the curve of a bone that looked far too old to be recent. The compost heap wasn't compost. It was a graveyard. This is how she grew them. This is why the vegetables were so big. They were feeding on people. I told you it was good for the soil. The voice came from right behind me. I spun around, dropping my flashlight. Mrs. Gable was standing 5 feet away. She was holding a spade, a heavy, sharp-edged garden spade. Her face was illuminated by the moonlight. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes were dead voids. "You shouldn't be here, neighbor," she said. She swung the spade. I threw myself to the side. The metal blade sliced through the air where my head had been and impacted the ground with a dull thud. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't look back. I could hear her behind me, not running like an old woman, but sprinting. She was fast, unnaturally fast. "Here, puppy, puppy," she taunted, her voice a cackle now. I vaulted the fence, catching my foot and tumbling onto my own lawn. I heard her slam against the wood on the other side. I scrambled to my back door, fumbling with the keys, dropping them, picking them up. I heard the gate unlatch. I got the door open, slammed it, and threw the deadbolt just as a heavy weight slammed into the wood. I called the police from the upstairs bathroom, locking that door too. When the police arrived, Mrs. Gable was sitting on her front porch, drinking tea. She told them I was a hysterical young man who had been trespassing. She invited them in for cookies. But they found the hole. They found the meter reader. And under the pumpkins, they found 6 more. Drifters, runaways, people no one looked too hard for. And Barnaby. She had caught him digging near the bodies. Mrs. Gable, her real name was something else entirely. A name linked to a series of disappearances in the 70s, is in a maximum security psychiatric ward now. But I can't look at a garden anymore. I can't walk down the produce aisle. Every time I see a pumpkin, big and round and orange, I wonder what it was fed. I wonder who's inside it. City living is lonely. You're surrounded by thousands of people, stacked on top of each other in concrete boxes, yet you never really know anyone. You see snippets of their lives through lit windows, like silent movies playing on loop. I lived in a complex called the Arches. It was 2 buildings facing each other across a narrow, dirty alleyway. My apartment was on the 4th floor, and my living room window looked directly into the apartment across the alley. The guy who lived there was odd. I never saw his face clearly. He always kept the lights off. The only illumination in his place came from the blue flicker of a massive television screen that seemed to be on 24/7s. I called him Blue Light. For the first 6 months, I didn't pay him much attention. I had my own life, my own job, my own stress. But then the feeling started. You know that prickle on the back of your neck? That primal instinct that tells you eyes are on you? I started feeling it every night when I got home from work. I'd be cooking dinner or reading on the sofa, and I'd feel exposed. I'd look out the window, and there he would be, a dark silhouette standing in his window, backlit by the blue glow, staring straight into my apartment. I bought blinds. I kept them closed, but the feeling didn't go away. Then things in my apartment started to feel off. It was subtle gaslighting. I'd come home and the throw pillows on my couch would be rearranged. The milk carton I left on the top shelf of the fridge would be on the middle shelf. The toilet seat would be up when I lived alone and always put it down. I changed the locks. I assumed the landlord was snooping or maintenance was coming in without notice. But it kept happening. One night, I came home late. I didn't turn on my lights immediately. I dropped my bag and walked to the window to peek through the slats of the blinds. Blue Light was there, but he wasn't standing at the window. He was in the middle of his living room, and for the first time, he had a lamp on, a dim yellow floor lamp. I squinted. The layout of his apartment looked familiar, eerily familiar. He had a gray sectional sofa, just like mine. He had a coffee table with a glass top, just like mine. He had a bookshelf in the corner, filled with books. I grabbed a pair of binoculars I used for birdwatching. I focused them on his room. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just similar furniture. It was my furniture. Not the actual items, but identical replicas. He had bought the exact same IKEA sofa, the same rug. He had even positioned the TV at the exact same angle as mine. He had recreated my living room in his apartment. And then I saw the mannequin. It was standing in the center of the room. It was a female dressmaker's dummy. It was wearing a red sweater. I looked down at my own chest. I was wearing a red sweater. I backed away from the window, my breath catching in my throat. This was insane. This was beyond stalking. This was obsession. I watched him. He was moving around the mannequin. He was walking softly, placing his feet carefully. He walked from the kitchen area to the couch. He paused behind the mannequin. He reached out and mimed wrapping something around the mannequin's neck. He held it for 10 seconds. Then he let go and walked to the door. He was practicing. He was rehearsing a murder. My murder. He was learning the layout of my apartment so he could navigate it in the dark. He was timing how long it took to cross the room. He was perfecting the chokehold. I grabbed my phone to call the police. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped it. As I bent down to pick it up, the lights in my apartment went out. Pitch black. I froze. The power didn't just go out. I heard the breaker snap. My fuse box was in the hallway, outside the apartment. I looked out the window. Across the alley, Blue Light's apartment was dark. The lamp was off. The TV was off. Then, I saw his front door open. He stepped out into the hallway of his building. He was wearing black. He was carrying something in his hand. A length of rope? A wire? He wasn't looking at my window anymore. He was heading for the stairs. He was coming over. The rehearsal was over. It was opening night. I didn't think. I didn't grab my coat. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the drying rack, the only weapon I had, and I ran to my front door. I locked the deadbolt. I dragged a heavy chair under the doorknob. I heard the heavy metal door of my building's lobby creak open 4 floors down. I ran to the fire escape window in my bedroom. It was painted shut. I had never checked it. I slammed the heel of my hand against the frame, screaming in frustration. It wouldn't budge. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Soft, deliberate footsteps. Not rushing. He knew the timing. He knew exactly how long he had. He stopped outside my door. The doorknob rattled, gently, testing it. Then silence. I stood there, gripping the skillet, tears streaming down my face. I have a gun. I screamed, my voice cracking. I called the cops. They're on their way. No answer. Then a sound that froze my blood. A scratching sound, like metal on metal. He was picking the lock. I watched the deadbolt turn. Click. The door pushed inward, but the chair held it. It jammed against the floor. The door shuddered as he threw his weight against it. Thud, thud. "Let me in, Sarah," a voice whispered. It wasn't a stranger's voice. It was a voice I heard every day. It was the building superintendent, the guy who had the master keys, the guy who fixed my sink, the guy who changed my locks last week when I complained about the break-ins. He wasn't living across the alley. He had rented that unit under a fake name just to watch me, to practice. The door began to splinter. The wood frame was giving way. I smashed the bedroom window with the skillet. The glass shattered outward, raining down into the alley. The noise was deafening. I screamed, "Fire!" at the top of my lungs. Lights flickered on in the building across the way. People came to their windows. The pounding on my door stopped. He heard the neighbors. He knew the audience was watching. I heard running footsteps retreating down the hall. By the time the police arrived, the superintendent was gone. His apartment in the basement was empty, cleared out in minutes. But across the alley, in the apartment with the blue light, they found it all. The furniture, the photos of me taped to the mannequin's face, and a notebook. It was a log. Trial 1, tripped on rug. 14 seconds to target. Too slow. Trial 15, floorboard creaks by sofa. Step left. Trial 42, perfect run. 6 seconds, silent, ready. I don't live in the city anymore. I moved back to the suburbs, into a house with an alarm system and a big dog. But I still keep my curtains drawn. And I never, ever buy red sweaters. Because sometimes, when I'm walking down the street, I see a blue light flickering in a window, and I wonder if he's somewhere new, setting up the furniture, getting ready for the next performance. And that's all for tonight. Remember, the most terrifying monsters are the ones that look just like us. The ones who might even live right next door. If these stories serve as a good reminder to trust your instincts, then show your support and like and subscribe. Hitting that bell means you'll get a warning before the next nightmare begins. Sleep well, if you can.